all hear me okay? Is that coming through? Fantastic. Well, first of all, a huge thank you for you guys all coming today for our final event of Richmond Climate Week. It's been a fantastic week and we've engaged with people from right across the borough on 7 different topics all about climate change. So we started Monday looking at food waste, recycling, and we had some fantastic events including a cooking demonstration from local chef Livio. We then moved on to energy on Tuesday and we chatted to lots of people about saving energy in their home and also how we can create energy groups and make our borough as energy efficient and as energy and climate positive as possible. And then on Wednesday we had a fantastic day with lots of the local schools and we ran a primary and both a secondary conference and we had engagement from right across the borough and we ran a mock COP, so we had the students playing roles of China and the UK and the USA, as well as playing roles of the Prime Minister and also head of companies and things like that. And they got really engaged with it and they did a fantastic job, and there'll be a bit of a report about that event too. And then on the Thursday we focused on how climate is impacting our heritage. In a borough like Richmond, it's really important that we think about our heritage as well as our green spaces when we're thinking about climate. And then on Friday we had a day focused on transport, on air quality, and some of you joined us at events looking at cargo bikes and how we can think about moving out of a car. And then yesterday we had a fantastic open forum, and I know some of you joined us at that to have a chat and really talk with everyone and talk to some of the panellists here about what they're doing and some fantastic community groups about what they're doing, as well as having a chance to have your say. And then today we got people practically involved. We had over 60 people litter picking down on Richmond foreshore, clearing up the River Thames. We also had practical workshops and bulb planting and nature conservation work right across the borough. So this has all been part of Richmond Climate Week, a fantastic week to engage people about that small activities that they can do themselves to make a big difference to us as a borough. I should have probably introduced just myself. I'm Fran, I'm the Nature Conservation Manager for Habitats and Heritage. Habitats and Heritage are a local charity. We are both a built and natural charity. We have 4 main pillars of our work. Surprisingly, habitats and heritage, but also community and climate. We work with the community to engage them in projects to make their spaces better for biodiversity, better for themselves, better for the community, and better for our climate. So that's probably enough from me. So I'm going to hand over to our chair and our panellists. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you've got some great questions because we will be opening it to the floor. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Fran. My name is Claire O'Connor. I work for Richmond Council, and I'm lucky enough to have our climate change team, or the green team as we call them internally, working with me. And I will be the chair of today's panel. So I'm going to ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves to you, and then I've got a couple of questions, and then we're going to throw it open to the floor for hopefully lots of questions from you. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll go to questions. So Charlotte, do you want to go first?
So my name is Charlotte Morley. I'm the founder of The Little Loop, which is a circular economy business focused on keeping children's clothing in circulation to try to reduce the environmental impact. I founded it 2 years ago, but prior to that I did a degree in environmental history, well in geography specialising in environmental history up 20 years ago now, so a while back. And actually didn't do much to do with sustainability thereafter, because 20 years ago there wasn't very much going on in that sphere unless you wanted to work in renewable energy, which is not really my thing. And actually it was having children a few years ago that refocused me, and I think having spoken to lots of people, it's a quite common theme, is that those of us who consider ourselves sustainably minded, sometimes it takes a big event in our lives to make us actually do something about it, and having children really did focus my mind. So instead of returning to my job, I decided to set up The Little Loop. And really my focus is on giving consumers the tools that you and that we need to be able to make the changes in our lives that will make a difference. I did work in the public sector for 12 years, actually working in a security service. So doing good, but realising that with administration, etc., I wasn't really able to have the impact that I could have, and I did start to see the impact that the private sector could have in giving consumers the tools that they needed to change the way that they lived. So that's my focus, that's where my business kind of comes from, and my focus today, if anyone has questions for me, is really around what you can do as a consumer and what it is that we as businesses in the private sector can do to help everybody to make more sustainable choices in their lives.
Thank you, Charlotte. And now on to Rachel.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Hi, I'm Rachel Purden. I'm the Head of Sustainability at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. So I'm here to talk about Kew's mission to protect biodiversity, plants and fungi for the benefit of humankind and all life on Earth. And this really important moment with COP26 and with the great acceleration and increase in interest and focus and awareness around the twin crises that we're facing, that humanity is facing, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, the ways that those crises overlap and the ways that the potential solutions, so nature, the restoration, the protection, the management and protection and preservation of nature can be a solution to both the climate crisis and the nature crises. But in my role as Head of Sustainability, I've also been writing and have launched Kew's new sustainability strategy, which sets out how Kew will change its actions, its expertise and its voice, so use those three pathways to sustainability to accelerate climate action and to both change the way we're operating and to use our expertise and use our voice to accelerate that change outside of our gardens and our walls. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that strategy, I'm sure, as the questions come up. But one of the other things that's important to mention is that Kew has been at COP26. Kew has a stand at COP26. And so this is a really important opportunity to focus attention on that overlap between the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the role that Kew has to play in supporting humanity, supporting businesses, supporting organisations, supporting governments all around the world in making change to tackle those twin crises. My background is, before working at Kew, I've worked at Kew for nearly 2 years. I worked in the university sector. I was in university sustainability teams, and many universities are organisations that have also gone first and gone fast in setting climate targets, setting carbon reduction targets. And so I worked in 3 UK universities working to deliver those emissions reductions and those sustainability actions and activities with staff and students in the way in which universities are functioning. Okay, I think that's everything from me.
Thank you, Rachel. And now over to you, Julia.
Thank you, and it's a delight to be here with such a knowledgeable, climate-focused company, and I'm very grateful to my fellow panellists for taking the time to join us in Twickenham. I also want to acknowledge the work that Habitats and Heritage have put into Climate Week alongside our Green Team to hold so many varied events covering biodiversity, heritage, energy efficiency, food, and encouraging community participation and including some very lively work with schools, which I was also fortunate to participate in. And because some of those events were necessarily online, they've been recorded, so we've got those resources to draw on for future engagement, which I think is a very positive outcome. So I'm chair of Richmond's Environment, Sustainability, Culture and Sport Committee. We're obviously focusing very much on the environment and sustainability side of things today. That role encompasses many climate-related matters, such as planning policy, waste and recycling, parks and trees, flood risk management, biodiversity and others besides. I'm also Richmond's rep on the West London Waste Authority, which is our waste disposal authority, and the South West London rep on the Thames Regional Flood and Coast Committee. And I'm mentioning those bodies just to show the level of work that goes on a cross-borough, pan-London basis. And I know that cooperation and setting aside of some of our political differences is really crucial in facing climate challenges and ecological challenges as well. That's true locally, and I really hope that everyone at COP is working in that same spirit. So Richmond Climate Week has drawn residents and community organisations into this debate on climate change and on the importance and the possibility of taking action. We've highlighted some of what we're doing in the borough as a council, and our partners, Habitats and Heritage, and other community groups and residents as well. Having declared a climate emergency in July 2019, I think it was, the time flies, the council developed its climate emergency strategy that included engagement with communities and, very excitingly, a schools summit with Sir David Attenborough, which was very inspiring, and a full consultation with the public. And our resulting action plan is, I think, far-reaching. It's been well received, and we hope it reflects what residents in the community expect of us, as well as taking us along the path that we need to follow, with an annual review and refresh programme, because it's a dynamic document, it's not a fixed moment in time. And by itself, of course, that's not going to be sufficient, and we're not complacent. But the council is very much committed to the cause, and I welcome the discussion on this today. Thank you all for coming to join in. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with some questions up here on the panel, and we're going to make them quite short, and then we're going to throw it open to you. So the first question, which I think we'll start with Rachel, because she's already mentioned the COP, is what is important about COP26 and what do you hope will come out of it?
So I'm not sure it's possible to answer that question extremely briefly, but I'll do my best. There are obviously a huge number of important outcomes that we're all hoping for from COP26. I guess as Councillor has mentioned, collaboration and cooperation and bringing a huge number of stakeholders and parties together in this moment of building momentum, building focus, and building scrutiny. And I think that's one of the key things for me to highlight from COP26 is there are some fundamental negotiations going on, there are some fundamental agreements and announcements that are crucial, but it's important to recognise this huge bringing together of attention and focus and stakeholders and collaborators from all over the globe, and that includes the sort of 197 governments who are participating, governmental organisations and organisations such as Q. So Q has a stand in the blue zone, in the delegate zone, in the UN Pavilion. We're an official partner of the UN in the delivery of the UN Pavilion at COP, and that has facilitated some really positive and really exciting conversations. And while those conversations and collaborations aren't the formal negotiation, the formal government level agreement that are also crucial from COP as a conference, they do build momentum, they build attention, they build scrutiny, and scrutiny and accountability are really important outcomes of this process. But in terms of the kind of more formal side, what we're all looking for is to keep 1.5 degrees on the table and keep 1.5 degrees as a clear goal that all governments should be working towards, that all businesses should be working towards, and to kind of ratchet up the level of ambition from the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was targeting well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees if possible, and really ratchet that up to make sure that we're all on the same page about absolutely keeping 1.5 degrees as our safe, or not safe, but we don't want to go beyond 1.5 degrees of warming if at all possible. So within that, obviously countries are submitting updated carbon emission reduction plans or targets for 2030. And that's one of the key points, is that 2030 is a point by which we need to have seen significant change. So I think there's, especially in the UK, there's a sort of widespread acknowledgement, there's widespread momentum behind the net zero by 2050 target which the UK government has set, and which the UK government recently released its net zero strategy for how the UK as a whole and the UK economy as a whole will reach net zero by 2050. But much more urgently and much more importantly, the emissions reductions that the UK can achieve and that countries around the world can achieve by 2030. So the UN says we need to have halved emissions by 2030. So that's the kind of timescale that we're talking about, some really significant changes taking place on. So countries will be updating their emissions reductions targets by this 2030 deadline, which is really crucial. There are some other crucial negotiations taking place on frameworks, international frameworks, around factors like emissions, carbon trading markets, and international carbon offsets. And those are things that we will all need to understand in a lot more detail in terms of how we deliver those safely, how we deliver those without having adverse impacts on communities or without having adverse impacts on global biodiversity. So those conversations are also really important. And then the third kind of fundamental negotiation taking place is around this refinancing. So the $100 billion of refinancing for developing nations that are required for them to transition to sustainable energy sources, etc. So those kind of core negotiations are crucial, and this wider discussion, wider collaboration, and wider scrutiny. And from Hugh's point of view, we're absolutely pleased and delighted and building momentum behind the bringing together of the climate and nature message. So nature is a critical part of climate action. To reach net zero, we will need to invest in nature-based solutions. We need to invest in the restoration and protection of habitats all around the world. And nature can help protect communities from the impacts of climate change, as well as capturing carbon, as well as carbon sequestration. Sorry, that wasn't very brief. I tried my best.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Rachel. Charlotte, is there anything you'd like to
Very
add?
glad Rachel went first. I mean, I think just to go back to the targets, I don't know if everybody understands how much we were not on track for what was agreed in Paris. So actually we were looking at 2.7 degree increase before COP26. So just to kind of literally make it as stark as possible, that's the importance of COP26, that we need to bring it back to where we were with Paris. So it's not that Paris was agreed and we were very much trotting along happily and going to achieve it. We were not. We had gone way off course. So I think COP26 is being talked about as the last chance. You know, this is just reminding everybody that we cannot go back to where we were before COP26. So I think, you know, just to really make that very, very tangible. I mean, very much from my perspective, what I do on a daily basis is talk to people about their attitudes to climate change. Because I'm trying to understand where my business fits into this and how we can help and how we can have the greatest impact. We're a business for good, and so we're not here to make a profit. Well, we are a business for profit. I'm not going to kind of not tell the truth about that, but essentially we are a business for good, and that is one of our overriding concerns. And therefore talking to people about how we can get them to change their behaviours in order that we can have an impact is our daily bread. And what I've noticed as a result of COP26 is that everyday people on the street are now talking about this all the time. I don't actually watch this, but I did catch Gogglebox. I promise I don't watch it all the time, but I caught it the other night. And one of the very first things that was mentioned on Gogglebox was COP26. That to me is absolutely critical. That everyday people who are on Gogglebox are talking about this, and that means it's in the consciousness of the public, and that means that people are going to be thinking about what they can do. It's incredibly important that governments, of course, are making these changes, but if consumers and citizens are not doing it, then we're not going to go in the right direction. So for me, that's been one of the strongest kind of positives around it, that it's really focused everybody's minds and attention on this crisis.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you. You've given a great deal of detail, which is why you're here to bring that knowledge. And I mean, but in more general terms, I would say the same thing. I hope to see progressive agreements between parties on how to limit the warming, and following on that, from that, importantly, the implementation. It's not enough just to turn up at a conference and speak the right words. You've got to go away and do it with an action plan, interim agreements, keeping the focus. Don't leave it too late. Well, it's already a bit late, so that's what you're saying, I think, about ratcheting up. The determination has to be even greater now. In the borough, I think the importance is that renewed energy and interest from community organisations and residents, which you've mentioned. Whether that's energy efficiency and, you know, what can I do as a resident, on active travel, how do I access active travel, how do I protect habitats? It's all these phrases and all these concepts are being talked about. And at a sub-regional and pan-London level, it's been a very timely backdrop for our renewed commitment to the actions that we're taking, to our lobbying. We need a clear strategy from our government, we need action and we need funding, and that needs to be set out by in Westminster so that local authorities know the framework they're operating in and they can have the resources to do so. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I mean, in all of the answers there, we've talked about how it's a real powerful thing that COP26 is making everybody on the street think about climate change and think about the actions they can take. And I suppose a question that I've got for the panel is, what actions can individuals take? Sometimes it can seem like it's too big a mountain to climb. Are there very kind of straightforward, simple steps that you would recommend to the audience and to the people who watch that they can take? And I'll start with you, Charlotte, if that's all right.
Well, I can talk about this all day. I think the first thing to say is to not be overwhelmed by it. I think it's such a huge existential problem that a lot of people, it's human nature to put up a wall and to say, this is not my, I can't deal with this, and therefore I'm going to let somebody else deal with it. And that's not to say that, I'm not criticising people. I think that is human nature, that we feel overwhelmed and therefore we say, okay, I'm just going to think about something else. But actually, there is no need to be overwhelmed by it, because there are lots of simple things that you can do, and a lot of it is actually just about shifting attitudes and starting to think in a slightly different way. Because of the nature of my business and because we are focused on children and parents, I talk about simplicity all the time, because we're trying to get through not just to the parents but also to the children, and trying to help everybody deal with climate anxiety and think about how they can do it. And we talk about 4 steps. So the first is to love nature, and I think I won't talk too much about this because I think that's very much in Rachel's purview, but it's so important that we understand why we're doing this, and particularly when we're working with children, when we're talking to children, but actually for adults as well, to be out in nature, to be experiencing it and appreciating it. We can take it for granted, but actually if we understand what it is that we're doing this for, then that actually helps to keep us motivated and keep us going. So that's the first thing. The second is to use less. It's a really incredibly simple thing to do, to consume less, which might sound very strange coming from somebody who runs a business, but that's what my business is all about, and I think that's what, if there's only one thing you do, and that goes from energy to using a vehicle, to the clothes that you wear, to the food that you eat. It's a focus on not wasting things, only buying the things that you need, and particularly as Christmas comes up, you know, it's so tempting to go out and just to buy all the things, because that's what we have been conditioned, understandably, over years. It's what we think that we have to do, and over years we've thought about it in a way where there is no responsibility. That's just what we are able to do. We now understand the impact of that. So using less. When we are using things, the third step is to buy better. So think about what it is that you are consuming and make sure that you are doing it in the best way possible. So whether that be using a renewable energy company as opposed to a conventional energy company, or when you're buying clothing, think about, is it ethical, is it sustainably produced, is it organic cotton versus normal? There are little things that we can do, and it doesn't need to be complicated, but thinking about doing it better. And again, it's just about being conscious. It's about conscious consumers and conscious behaviour. So making sure that we're not just mindlessly doing things. It's very tempting, I think, to think, and I understand this, I have 2 small children, my husband and I are both incredibly busy, etc. It's very easy to think, but I'm in a rush, I'll just do what I'm used to. I think that's the one thing that we've all got to step back and think we really need to take responsibility and be a bit more conscious about what we do. And then the final thing I would say is to look after what you have. So actually, again, we are a society where we've got busy and less mindful about what we do in our daily lives, and we think it's okay to bung our washing in, stick a washing tab in and stick it on 60, and actually step back, slow down and think about looking after what you've got, making it last longer. It ties back into using less. But it's a very simple way of making sure that your own personal impact is much lower. So it's about wasting less, it's about making things last, and it's about appreciating what we've got. So those are quite simple, and they might sound very simple, but that's the whole point, because actually if you do that, you will have an impact. On top of that, what I would say is hold people to account, hold businesses to account, hold your councillors to account, hold your politicians to account, and tell them what you want, because change won't happen unless they are hearing you say, this is what we want, we the people. You do have power. And I know it doesn't feel like it often. I often feel overwhelmed, and I often feel like I'm just one voice and what can I do? And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. My business is all about me trying to have an impact and trying to feel like I'm back in control. But it is incredibly powerful being able to hold businesses to account. You can write a letter to H&M and say, why is it that you aren't paying your workers a fair living, a fair wage? And they have to listen once the critical mass of that reaches a certain level. And of course, you can hold them to account with your spending as well. So those would be that is my 2 pence worth.
Fantastic, Charlotte, thank you. Julia, should we go to you next?
Yes, why not? I was asked this in a slightly different way at the school summit. My advice to the young people is learn your science, get your education so that you're full of knowledge, so that as you grow, you'll be the botanists, the health workers, the doctors, the teachers, the marine biologists of the future. You will take on the baton from us, and you will need to be prepared to do what you can. I'm trying to be inspirational and hopeful. You hold it within you, and do your homework sort of thing and listen to your teachers. But that's true at any age, of course. We can all learn a bit of the science and understand that. Why is it we need to take these actions? And as you've said, a little bit of reducing your energy usage, rejigging your housekeeping habits, talking to people, talking to your children, talking to your parents, talking to your friends and neighbours, so that we normalise, so that it's normal, so that you're all thinking about using the car less, sharing a car perhaps, things like that. And I would also say you can lobby decision makers. I think that's echoing the point. And I would say this, you can also show your support for decision makers who are trying to do the right things, trying to make bold climate-focused decisions that might not be universally popular. They might involve things like parking or managing the local wildlife in a different way. It might involve a change of appearance in your local area, some different way of doing things, something you might be asked to pay a bit more for. And it's important to try and understand that. And when you see that there's a diligent decision being made, think about it and support it. I'm not saying you have to vote for that person, that's not what this is for at all, but it's just getting the language, the terminology and the general conversation moving in the right direction with the support of people who know what they're talking about around climate change and can put that in the public arena and encourage the right sort of decisions.
Thank you. Rachel?
Thank you. And to agree with much of what's been said, one of my points, which I won't reiterate too much, was to talk about climate, talk about sustainability, and hold people to account. Call out, make your voice heard if you see a business or an organisation or a councillor or whoever doing something that you think doesn't meet with the pathway that we need to be on to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises. But also on the positive side, try to sell the positives of the transition, because this can often feel so overwhelming and so negative and so daunting and so challenging. And actually, this is a transition to net zero. It's a transition that will have a huge number of enormously positive side effects. Our communities will be closer, our communities will be greener, our air will be cleaner, we'll have a healthier, happier relationship with the stuff that we buy. It's not all bad, even though sometimes it can feel like it. And having those positive conversations about the ways in which this is exciting, the ways in which our society will be different in 10, 20, 30 years, that can bring people together, that's such an important part of this kind of this wave of momentum that we're all seeing, and acknowledging that some of these changes will be hard for people. And so while it's very positive to have it be on the news all the time, which it is at the moment, some people find that overwhelming and some people find that terrifying, because it's going to involve changes that they don't feel ready for, or that they feel threaten something they love, or threaten their way of life. And so talking about those positives, even though it can feel like a lot to be constantly having those conversations, that's a really important part of what we can all do. To talk a bit about, I guess, horticulture things, because I think as Q I probably should. Obviously protect biodiversity, protect local biodiversity in terms of what you can do in your garden or allotment or window box. Try to plant species that are protecting and preserving local biodiversity, and most importantly, don't use peat. Don't use peat-based compost, and don't buy plants or compost that contain peat. That's one of the most important things. And I guess also just to acknowledge. So there are a huge number of personal choices, some of them easy, some of them difficult, that affect your personal carbon footprint, affect your personal impact. Some of those are easy to understand and some of those are very difficult to understand, and that's okay. Those choices will gradually get easier as we see the systems change that we need to see. And so we do need some pioneers to do things that are slightly more difficult at the beginning, to get the air source heat pump, even though the industry isn't quite ramped up yet and it still seems a bit new and scary. And those people are doing a really important and difficult thing by going first. And that's usually those people are people in a position of reasonable privilege in that they are able to go first. They're able to do that while it's more difficult. So one of the things that I think sometimes can get perceived the wrong way is people being told that they should all switch to an electric car, when that might seem like it's a cost, it's difficult, it's expensive, that's a big ask at the moment. And that's, in terms of my personal experience, that's one of the things I did until recently. I had an electric car, and it triggered a huge range of conversations with people. I mean, it was quite exciting. You meet people all the time who come up to you and say, oh, tell me about it, how does it work, where do you charge, how's it going, what experience, how do you find the experience? And so by doing that thing that was a bit difficult, and by helping that transition, that was an important personal impact, but more importantly than just my impact, it catalysed change in people I knew, people I spoke to, people who were able to then see that that was possible and understand that they could make the change, and gradually it will get easier and it will become much more normalised and less of a kind of a pioneering choice that needs to be made by those individuals who go first. But even better than going electric is not having a car at all. So I've now sold my electric car and I travel by bicycle and public transport, which is the long-term choice, I hope. So I hope transport innovation will continue to get easier.
Brilliant.
Just to add, I think something that's really important, I know there are some parents with children in here, those incredible children that we saw with their posters. Our children are hearing about this an awful lot in schools, on the television, in children's television programmes. And the best thing I think that we as parents can do is to help them to understand it by helping them to take action and by doing it together and learning with them. Because if they feel like they're doing this on their own, then they are going to find that incredibly difficult. And actually, sometimes as parents, it's quite hard to admit that we're maybe further behind in our thinking than our children are. But actually, the best thing that we can do is to take them by the hand and learn with them and take action with them and help them to feel empowered and in control by doing things together. And I think for any parents in the room, or for any grandparents in the room, or people who know parents, that's a message that I would, press home very strongly, because otherwise our children are going to feel like they're doing this on their own, and because they are a lot. I've got a 4-year-old who gets this better than some 40-year-olds that I know, so I think that's a really important thing that we must remember.
Thank you. I think those are some really great tips for individuals to take forward, and also for everybody here to share, as well, to kind of get that message through that it is small steps, not always easy steps, but small steps that we can all take. Kind of taking it up a level, what can organisations do in terms of climate change? We've talked about how we can lobby our councils, businesses, we can write to them, but actually what should we be looking for them to do? What changes should we be looking for them to do? Julia, do you want to go first?
I'll give it a go, with the organisation in question obviously being the council. The message I think applies across organisations really, that if you're wanting to set a good example and to tell a good story, you need to look at your own estate, your own operations, and you need to invest your money where you can in energy efficiency. The council is also investing in carbon literacy, so that all staff members have an understanding of why decisions are being made differently, not just what the decisions are, so that it's a whole organisation approach. And we often talk as council members about being in silos, that the climate emergency sits with the environment, possibly a little bit with transport, but it doesn't. It's across finance, it's across education, and it's across health. And we need to think collectively, and officers likewise. And one of the really great things that we had in the council is that this team, the Green Team, the Climate Team, sits under the Chief Executive and is an overarching team who can go into any of the departments and chat to any of the directors and make progress as a corporate body. So organisation, obviously, it manages a lot of land. Therefore, we can influence and, in some cases, control how we manage our biodiversity. And that's a really important thing. We've been trying to tackle habitat fragmentation, which is typically where insect populations can't travel across the landscape because it's all hard surfacing, built development, and trying to look at ways in which we can introduce green corridors or just let our verges grow more naturally, encourage people to do what we're doing, try and reduce pesticide use, try and encourage wetland areas, try and, in small ways across the borough, make a difference collectively. The other thing we can do, we have good communication channels. We have social media, we have newsletters, and we have community meetings. And I get the privilege of speaking on a platform like this, so we can encourage and influence our residents and our community organisations and signpost them to resources, help them bid for funding as we look for funding for our own operations as well. And we can work in partnership with other boroughs, other organisations, and share good practice. You know, it's not reinvent the wheel each time, but if our neighbouring borough is putting together a really good project on some aspect of waste and recycling, why would we not do that in all boroughs and use it as a case study, a blueprint for other things? One area in the borough I'm quite proud of our officers. This is in the east of the borough, over towards Barnes and the Beverley Brook catchment area, where we've been able to unlock substantial funding from DEFRA, from the government, to implement a whole range of innovative surface water flooding schemes. I think you mentioned nature-based solutions, and that's a phrase that I'm hoping people will understand increasingly, how we use nature to help protect us, and how we, in tackling the climate emergency, which can seem daunting and seem a bit dry, and it's all about sacrifice and giving things up, how we can actually put in resources to do something lovely in an area, such as improve the greening, such as improve the situation with surface water flooding. Those are two strands, co-benefits we call them, where you do one thing to tackle climate change, but you make the street look lovely as well, which has good impacts on people's health and well-being. And it's how you knit all those things together within your organisation, and then in partnership with other organisations, you share best practice. So that would be my starting point as an answer to that question.
Brilliant, thank you. Rachel?
This is a very good question. I'll answer mostly from a Q perspective, but I think broadening things out a little bit. So obviously one of the most important things that the businesses and organisations can do is to change the way that they operate, manage their footprint, both in terms of climate and in terms of biodiversity. So the way that has worked at Q is that we have written and launched our new sustainability strategy, which contains a target to become climate positive by 2030. And what we mean by climate positive is net zero plus a little bit better. So reaching net zero by reducing carbon emissions as rapidly as possible, and then by investing in the restoration of nature to more than offset the difference for any unavoidable emissions. But the most important feature being to stop carbon emissions as rapidly as possible. Q has used an international framework which is known as science-based targets. So science-based targets, the SBTI is an organisation that essentially takes the Paris Agreement with this aim to stick well below 2 degrees or preferably within 1.5 degrees of warming, and translates that into a global carbon budget. So if we're going to stick to that 1.5 degrees, what's the available carbon budget? That carbon budget is then split down by sector, and basically each organisation that uses the SBTI methodology is given a kind of upper limit. I have a personal problem with the term science-based target, because it's actually, in my mind, not really a target, it's a limit, it's a cap. It's here's your maximum available carbon budget. Obviously, please try not to spend it all, because if we go above that budget, that's when we're all in trouble. So Q has used this SBTI framework to establish our carbon budget for a 1.5 degrees pathway, and other organisations all around the world are using this same framework. And actually, there was just in the raft of the many announcements that have come out before COP or during the first week of COP26, one of the things that was just announced was a new framework from this same organisation, the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is a new definition for what net zero means. And that's really important because net zero is such an important concept. It's absolutely crucial that we globally reach net zero by 2050. Some countries will need to reach net zero faster than 2050, and some organisations will need to reach net zero much, much faster than that to hit this kind of halving of emissions this decade that we need to see. But while that concept has been adopted quite rapidly in terms of the number of commitments you'll see from governments and from businesses, that the concept of net zero has really been accelerating in terms of these targets. But the detailed definition of exactly what we all collectively mean by that has been a little bit slower in its development, and that's so important for those targets to have credibility, that we all understand exactly what that means. And so that's why this new framework from SBTI with a new definition of net zero will be so important in being able to hold people to account and hold people to those targets that they've set. So Kew has a science-based target, and we have a target to get to climate positive by 2030. Within that, there's a whole raft of things that will need to change, or adapt, or all good things that we've already done in terms of the way that we manage our gardens, the way that we travel, the way that we engage with visitors. So within our sustainability strategy, which I recommend you Google and have a read, we've actually set out a whole raft of more detailed commitments, with the headline target being to get to climate positive by 2030, and then sitting under that targets like for Kew to develop a new energy strategy, we're developing a new waste and recycling and reuse strategy, and we'll be developing a water strategy to look at the ways in which we can reduce the amount of maintenance of potable water and maximise the amount of rainwater and water saving activities that we're doing within the gardens. There are also commitments like the fact that we will encourage visitors to choose plant-based food and drink when they're on site. So that's something where we're not removing choices, but we are increasing the range of plant-based menu items that are available and seeking to encourage and enable people to make that choice. And again, with transport, that's another impact where we don't necessarily have a lot of direct control on the activity, so people will travel to our sites using a variety of modes of transport. We're seeking to enable and encourage people to travel using the most sustainable means of travel that is available to them. So there are 50-ish detailed commitments that sit underneath our headline targets. Those are across buildings, food, travel, biodiversity, water use, sustainable procurement, resource use. That's a big one in that, again, that's not just changing the way that we do things, but trying to engage our suppliers and reach out and engage with a much wider number of businesses to change the way they do things too. Our energy systems, our land use, as mentioned, nature-based solutions, and the opportunity to maximise the amount of carbon that's being drawn down and safely stored in our gardens, in our land. We've got a really exciting project at the moment to measure the above and below ground carbon sequestration for both Kew's main site in Kew and our Wakehurst site. And that, for the first time, we'll have a number on how much carbon is stored within our sites, which we've not previously been able to accurately measure using these new, we're using drones, we're using LiDAR, we're using some really interesting below ground measurement techniques as well. So land use is an important area. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about action, it's also about our expertise and our voice. So using our voice to share good practice, as Julia mentioned, to collaborate, and also to call for accelerated change from others, from our local partners and from our international partners. Kew works with over 400 partners in over 100 countries all around the world. And just to quickly loop back to expertise, so there's obviously expertise within our horticulture teams. Our horticultural teams went peat-free more than 20 years ago, and that was one of those pioneering things that Kew was able to do quite early. And it's now a case of sharing that expertise to help others, because I think we can all agree that progress UK-wide on going peat-free has been disappointingly slow. And so there's a lot of progress yet to be made there. And we also have scientific expertise in our conservation teams, in our teams who are researching nature-based solutions, who earlier this year ran a reforestation conference, which we had attendees from all around the world discussing how to ensure the wave of interest in tree planting is delivered in a positive way for biodiversity, and we're not ending up with some accidental side effects of carbon offsets, which might be a loss of biodiversity, or planting the wrong tree in the wrong place, which can have some unintended consequences. So one of Q's key messages from our scientists, from our conservation teams, is that we need the right trees in the right place for the right purpose, and that's actually a really nuanced set of expertise that needs to be developed for us to collectively tackle the climate crisis in the most positive way. Okay, I think that's probably enough for me.
We're going to step out a little bit and look across the kind of the breadth of organisations and talk about attitudinal shift and ambition. And I'd liken it to the digital transformation. So 10, 15 years ago, businesses talked about being a digital business in a way that, we're a digital business. We're digital first. And now every business is digital. You can't not be a digital business now, and we don't talk about it anymore. It's just part of what we do. It's what we call a hygiene factor. Right now, businesses and organisations talk about being sustainable businesses, a business built on sustainability, or a business or an organisation we need to get very quickly to a place where every business and every organisation is sustainable, where it's a hygiene factor. It's not something that we see as a differentiator. Everybody should have that, and it should be baked into every practice. So I think that from an ambition place, that's where we need to be. What COP26 is focused an awful lot on is energy. So one of the biggest shifts that we can make in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to change the way that we generate and utilise energy. But actually 45% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from the way that we extract, produce and consume resources. So it's the things that we buy, the things that we use. And so the thing that I want to see more, and the thing that's been shouted about and called upon for COP26, is a shift to a circular economy in which we use more efficiently resources and we regenerate our, essentially the biosphere where those resources are extracted from. So circularity is something that I think we need to talk about more and needs to be built into organisations and businesses from the very core so that they become circular. And it's something that we're still quite a long way away, and I know that as someone who's building a circular business from scratch, that actually there's not enough of it out there and it's still something that's very new. So circularity is critical, and it's, as I say, COP26 is not focused enough on it, and I think that's something that we would really call for, and for organisations to be thinking about that. And what circularity means, for anyone who doesn't know, and I apologise for teaching you to suck eggs, is simply that we should design products and design processes to use fewer resources, to last longer, and to be able to be fully broken down and recycled and reused. That we should change the way our systems function to enable resources to be recirculated. So in the example of my business, it's a children's clothing rental business. So the idea is that you don't own clothes anymore. There is not a linear economy where you buy something and you throw it away. You borrow it and then you send it back, and it gets recirculated and recirculated and recirculated until it can no longer be recirculated. Right now where we're at is that we have to recycle those clothes. But what we would like to get to is a place where those clothes have been designed in the first place so that they can be fully broken down, or so that they can be, with clothing you can't really upcycle, but let's talk about a washing machine, for example. We should be able to break it down into its constituent parts and reuse those parts again. So thinking about the way we design things, then the systems that utilise those things, and then the way that we dispose of them at the end. So we should be able to fully decompose everything that we're using back into its constituent resources so that they can be reused again. And if we double circularity, double the utilisation of circularity globally, we can reduce emissions hugely. But it's something that's still very much in its infancy, so I think it's something that I would obviously like to shout a lot about, but globally we need to drive more towards that.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and I agree with you that it's something that's only just beginning to be understood. One of the examples that I gave when talking to the students was the use of technical devices and mobile phones and things like that, where it's not just about the resources, it's about the conditions that young people in other countries are often working under in order to extract those items. And if we can break them down and reuse them, we get not just the benefit of the carbon reduction, but benefit in terms of better employment for people across the world, so that when they're earning their living, they're not putting their lives at risk,
Absolutely.
but they're doing something meaningful and sustainable. I
Absolutely.
think that's
And again, part of that design process, designing things to be circular, it does take into account designing them to be made in an ethical way, in a way which doesn't detract particularly from indigenous populations within countries which are more vulnerable to climate change. Actually, we should be empowering those nations and empowering those people and paying them fairly in order that they can look after the countries which actually end up being far more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than our countries are. And that is all part of the circular economy and the concept of it.